1944 was not a good year for the Axis. Italy had already surrendered, and Germany was getting pushed back on all fronts. On the Pacific front, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was unfolding. As many know, the result was an overwhelming American victory. We've seen the results from the Americans. However, how did it go down for the Japanese? A decisive victory for the Japanese was needed in order to turn the tide of the war, as stated by Admiral Toyoda in a post-war interview. Japan's oil supplies and resources were mainly in the Philippines, which was the next target of the Allies. If they stopped their fleet, the Japanese would be able to buy enough time to protect their resources. Unfortunately, though, they lost the battle. But how exactly did it affect the Japanese? The Battle of Leyte Gulf was divided into four main parts, namely the Battle of Sibuyan Sea, the Battle of Surigao Strait, the Battle off Samar, and the Battle of Cape Engano. Let's start in order. The Battle of Sibuyan Sea was essentially a one-sided slaughter from the American carrier aircraft against the Japanese main fleet. In the battle, the super battleship Musashi was lost, victim to at least 19 torpedo and 17 bomb hits. The Musashi, along with the Yamato, was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and its loss greatly impacted the morale of the entirety of Japan. The Battle of Surigao Strait was another loss for the Japanese. The Japanese Southern Force tried to sneak through the Surigao Strait in order to join up with the Japanese main fleet. However, their plans were intercepted and the Americans set up a deadly ambush, sinking all but one of the entire Japanese Southern Force, including two battleships. The only survivor was Shigure, which was later torpedoed and sank by American submarine Blackfin. It was a devastating defeat that the Japanese Navy would not recover from. During the battle, the Japanese had sent their remaining carrier forces up north to lure the American fleet into a chase, therefore leaving their landing forces unguarded. The trick was successful, baiting the Third Fleet away up north. The Japanese main force took this opportunity to attack the American landing fleets that were attacking the Philippines. Their raft fell on Taffy 3, Unit 77.4.3, which was a small carrier escort carrier force that was providing air support and anti-submarine screening for the landing troops. Taffy 3 composed of several escort carriers, which were much smaller and slower than regular carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts. Their force was almost a joke compared to the Japanese main fleet, as the Yamato itself outweighed the entirety of Taffy 3 combined. However, Taffy 3 launched a fierce counterattack, causing the Japanese to believe that they were actually facing the American Third Fleet, and after losing several destroyers and cruisers, along with communication difficulties, they withdrew. In reality, if they continued pushing forwards, they would have overpowered the small escort carriers and caused serious damage to the American landing forces, but they chose not to take the risk. Remember the Japanese carrier forces that had lured the American Third Fleet away? They were trying to flee north in order to avoid the Third Fleet, which was coming for them. However, they were unsuccessful, and the Third Fleet's carrier aircraft caught up. What happened next was basically a repeat of the Battle of Sibuyan Sea, where the remainder of Japanese carrier forces was completely decimated. In conclusion, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was a disaster for the Japanese, which caused the Japanese to suffer severe and irreparable losses. The morale of the Navy plummeted as a result of watching 28 ships sink, including the super battleship Musashi. In total, the Japanese suffered 12,500 total casualties, including almost all of the remaining experienced pilots and sailors. All of Japan's remaining functional aircraft carriers were now lost, meaning that naval aviation was useless. It was also the first time that the kamikaze tactic was employed, with the first ship being sunk, the USS St. Lo. But the hardest impact is the loss of all resources from the Philippines. The majority of Japan's oil supplies and other vital resources came from the Philippines. This meant that damaged ships from the battle either had to go to Singapore, where there was fuel but no repair facilities, or to mainland Japan, where they could be repaired but there was no fuel. Either way, the ships were considered generally lost due to this dilemma. Also, submarines had sunk remaining stragglers that were survived and returning from the battle. Also, along with many troop transports and supply convoys that were left unguarded because their escorts had joined the battle. The Japanese lost control of the Philippines. This meant that the Allies' next target would be the Japanese home islands. After the battle, Japanese command placed all plans on defending the islands, without hope of recovering the situation. The loss completely destroyed all hopes of the Japanese defense due to most of their military assets being crippled. This battle greatly shortened the time of the war as it destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy's strength to resist and forcing them to rely purely on defensive operations. It will be the last large battle Japan's Navy participated in. This is my mind map. It covers everything I just talked about. The research process was much more complicated than I expected, though. Because, whoever wins writes history, and the Americans obviously won, everything is from the American point of view. It's surprisingly difficult to find information from the Japanese perspective, and shows like the History Channel, unfortunately, from my opinion, have an American bias and are dramatized, making it appealing to watch like a TV show, but it skips out on many important facts. However, I was able to find enough information to answer all of my questions. I would probably be able to find more specific information if I did find such info, though.